King Richard II of England, 1377 to 1399, is one of the most complex and controversial monarchs in English history. Richard ascended to the throne at a young age, following the death of his grandfather, Edward III, and his reign saw the rise of tensions between the monarchy and the aristocracy, the transformation of the political landscape, and the eventual collapse of his rule. The events that led to Richard's downfall have been the subject of much debate, as they reflect the fragility of royal power, the influence of court factions, and the changing nature of medieval English politics. Richard II's reign began with great promise. He was initially seen as a capable and intelligent young king, but over time, his rule became characterized by his authoritarian style, reliance on unpopular advisors, and inability to manage the powerful nobility. Richard's failure to assert control over his kingdom and his controversial policies contributed to the eventual rebellion against his rule, culminating in his deposition and the rise of Henry IV. His downfall marked a turning point in English history, as it signified the end of the Plantagenet dynasty's absolute dominance and ushered in a period of instability that would define the next century. Richard II was born on January 6, 1367, the son of Edward, the Black Prince, and Joan of Kent. As the grandson of Edward III, Richard was a member of the Plantagenet royal family, one of the most powerful and influential dynasties in England. However, Richard's early life was marked by the premature death of his father in 1376. Edward, the Black Prince, had been the heir to the throne, and his death left Richard as the sole surviving male heir of the Plantagenet line. Richard's accession to the throne was thus precipitated by the death of his grandfather, Edward III, in 1377. Richard, only 10 years old at the time, became king at an extraordinarily young age. His minority meant that England was ruled by a regency, initially headed by his uncles, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, and others who wielded significant political power. The young Richard's minority placed him in a vulnerable position, and his early reign was heavily influenced by the dynamics of court factions and the ambitions of powerful noble families. The regency itself was tumultuous. The powerful lords of England, particularly the Lords Appellant, sought to limit the influence of Richard's uncles, who they saw as corrupt and self-serving. This period of regency set the tone for much of Richard's early reign, as he struggled to assert control over a kingdom fractured by factionalism and political rivalries. Richard's early reign was dominated by internal strife, with various factions competing for influence over the young king. One of the most significant challenges to Richard's authority came in 1381 with the outbreak of the Peasants' Revolt. The revolt, which began in the southeast of England, was a reaction to the harsh economic conditions of the time, including heavy taxation and the aftermath of the Black Death, which had drastically reduced the population. The peasants, who were already burdened by the poll tax and other taxes imposed by the crown, rose up in protest against the oppressive policies of the monarchy. The revolt was led by figures such as Wat Tyler and John Ball, who called for social and political reforms, including the abolition of serfdom and the end of the oppressive tax system. Richard, who was just 14 years old at the time, was thrust into a difficult situation. The rebels marched on London, and the king was forced to negotiate with them in an attempt to defuse the crisis. Richard's response to the revolt was both measured and strategic. On June 14, 1381, Richard met with Wat Tyler and the rebels at Smithfield, where he delivered a speech promising reforms and granting some concessions. However, Tensions escalated when Tyler was killed by the Lord Mayor of London, and Richard took swift action to restore order. The rebellion ultimately collapsed, and the leaders were executed. Despite the failure of the revolt, Richard's handling of the crisis demonstrated both his leadership qualities and his ability to engage in political maneuvering. The peasants' revolt had lasting consequences for Richard's reign. Although the immediate threat was quashed, the rebellion revealed the deep dissatisfaction among the common people and the vulnerabilities of the monarchy. In the aftermath, Richard took steps to ensure greater control over the government, but the revolt also signaled the growing divide between the monarchy and the common people, a divide that would only widen over time. After the defeat of the peasants' revolt, Richard II began to exert more control over his court and government. In 1386, Richard's position was further threatened by the Lords Appellant, a group of powerful nobles who had risen to prominence during his minority. The Lords Appellant, who included men like Thomas of Woodstock, the Duke of Gloucester, were increasingly dissatisfied with Richard's increasing assertiveness and the growing influence of his favourites. Richard, however, proved to be a skilled and ambitious ruler. In 1389, he declared that he was of sufficient age to govern independently, and he dismissed the Lords Appellant from their influential positions. This move marked a turning point in Richard's reign, as he began to consolidate power and assert his authority over both the nobility and his government. During the 1390s, Richard attempted to establish a more centralized and autocratic monarchy. He relied heavily on a small group of advisors, most notably Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and Robert de Vere, Duke of Ireland. These men became central figures in Richard's court, and their influence led to increasing resentment among the aristocracy. Richard's reliance on favorites, coupled with his apparent disregard for the traditional power structures of the nobility, deepened the rift between the king and his subjects. Richard's autocratic style of rule alienated many of the powerful nobles, who began to see him as a tyrant. His excessive spending on royal patronage and his disregard for the traditional rights of the aristocracy further exacerbated the tensions. Richard's policies increasingly favored his own interests and those of his close associates, while ignoring the demands of the nobility and the common people. By the late 1390s, Richard's political missteps had led to the rise of a serious challenge to his rule. The Lancastrian faction, led by Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt, Richard's uncle, was growing in strength. Henry had been exiled by Richard in 1398, but the growing discontent among the nobles and the weakening of Richard's position created an opening for Henry to return to England. In 1399, Richard's increasingly erratic behavior and inability to maintain control over his realm culminated in Henry's successful rebellion. Henry Bolingbroke, who had initially returned to England to reclaim his inheritance, was able to gain the support of key factions within the nobility. Richard, weakened by his unpopularity and isolated from potential allies, was eventually forced to surrender. In August 1399, Richard was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Richard II's deposition was a dramatic moment in English history. On September 30th, 1399, Richard formally abdicated the throne, and Henry Bolingbroke was crowned as Henry IV. Richard was subsequently held in confinement, and although he was allowed to live, he was effectively removed from power. His eventual death, believed to be by starvation or possibly foul play, further cemented the tragic nature of his reign. Richard's deposition marked the end of the direct Plantagenet line's control over the English throne. The Lancastrian dynasty, initiated by Henry IV, would rule England for the next century. Richard II's fall from power illustrated the volatility of medieval monarchy and the frailty of royal authority when confronted with rebellion and elite opposition. Despite the dramatic end to his reign, Richard II's legacy remains a subject of debate. He is often seen as a tragic figure, an intelligent and capable monarch whose idealism and authoritarian tendencies ultimately led to his downfall. His reign saw significant developments in the relationship between the monarchy and the nobility, and his deposition set the stage for the political struggles that would follow during the Wars of the Roses. Richard's reign also marked a critical shift in the nature of English kingship, as it demonstrated the importance of maintaining support from the aristocracy in order to retain power. King Richard II's reign was marked by a series of political, social, and military challenges that ultimately led to his deposition and the rise of the Lancastrian dynasty. Richard's early promise as a young king was overshadowed by his authoritarian rule, reliance on unpopular favorites, and inability to manage the complex political landscape of medieval England. The events of his reign underscore the fragility of royal power and the delicate balance between monarchs and the powerful aristocracy. Richard's tragic fall serves as a poignant reminder of the limits of monarchy in the face of rebellion, factionalism, and political maneuvering, and his legacy continues to resonate in the broader history of England's medieval kings.